Before Jeeps told you where to go and algorithms told you what to like, the American road trip was a different animal entirely. You loaded up the car, hit the highway, and somewhere between nowhere and the next rest stop, a giant fiberglass dinosaur or a neon-lit tunnel of mystery made you pull over without thinking twice. Those places had names, had stories, had regulars. And then one day, they didn't exist anymore. These are the 15 forgotten roadside attractions that completely disappeared. Number 15, Freedomland, USA, the Bronx, New York. If you've ever heard someone describe a place as the Disneyland of the East Coast, it probably wasn't Freedomland. But that's exactly what developers called it when it opened in the Bronx in 1960. A sprawling 85-acre theme park shaped, from the air, like a map of the United States, divided into regions themed around American history. The Great Plains had a cattle drive. The Old Southwest had staged gunfights. Chicago's Great Fire was reenacted multiple times a day, which sounds absolutely unhinged, but apparently people loved it. Freedomland drew millions of visitors in its first few years. The concept was genuinely ambitious. Part history lesson, part spectacle, part sweaty summer afternoon in the Bronx. And, to be fair, there was nothing quite like it. Visitors could walk from a New England fishing village into an Old West mining camp within the span of a few hundred feet. The park covered so much ground that an internal transportation system carried guests between sections. But the problems piled up fast. The park sat on swampy landfill that made construction and maintenance a constant headache. Flooding was routine, the rides broke down, labor costs were brutal, and competition from the 1964 World's Fair, held in Flushing Meadows just across the city, pulled enormous crowds away at exactly the wrong moment. By 1964, after just 4 seasons, Freedomland had gone bankrupt and closed. The entire site was eventually bulldozed and replaced by Co-op City, a massive housing complex that opened in 1968 and stands there to this day. Not a single structure from Freedomland survived. The Bronx got apartments. The East Coast got Disneyland anyway. Number 14, Dogpatch, USA. Marble Falls, Arkansas. Dogpatch, USA opened in 1968 in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, built around Al Cap's wildly popular Lil Abner comic strip. If you're under 50, you may not have encountered Lil Abner, which was a satirical newspaper comic that ran from 1934 to 1977 and took equal opportunity shots at rural poverty, political corruption, and American culture broadly. The park leaned fully into the hillbilly aesthetic. Rustic wooden buildings, costumed characters in patchwork outfits, and a setting built among genuine Ozark limestone caverns, and a natural waterfall that was actually quite beautiful if you could get past the faux illiterate signage. What made Dogpatch genuinely interesting as a place, separate from its source material, was the landscape. The Ozarks offered real caves and real running water and real dramatic terrain, and those things gave the park a physicality that purely manufactured attractions couldn't match. People who visited as children in the early 1970s remember the natural features more than the themed buildings. The park attracted celebrity visitors in its early years. Muhammad Ali reportedly showed up on opening day, which is a sentence that probably requires its own documentary. But Lil Abner's cultural relevance faded as the comic strip aged, and a theme park built entirely around a property most younger visitors had never heard of was fighting an uphill battle from the mid-1970s onward. You can't sell nostalgia to people who have no memory to be nostalgic about. Dogpatch, USA limped along until 1993, when it finally closed. The buildings decayed into the Ozark landscape. The caverns and waterfall remained, unbothered. The site sat abandoned for years, becoming a minor pilgrimage for urban explorers and roadside historians. Number 13, Prehistoric Forest, Alpena, Michigan. In the 1930s, someone decided that what roadside America needed was concrete dinosaurs. They were not wrong. Prehistoric Forest in Alpena, Michigan opened during that era when life-size dinosaur parks were genuinely a trend across the country. Entrepreneurs mixing cement, casting molds, and arranging enormous reptilian sculptures through wooded pathways for families to wander among. Prehistoric Forest had over 25 of them, scattered through the Michigan pines in a way that probably felt genuinely surprising if you came around a bend and found a full-scale T-Rex staring at you through the trees. The dinosaurs were not scientifically accurate, which was true of pretty much every dinosaur park built before paleontology got its act together in the latter half of the 20th century. Brontosauruses that science had already quietly retired were still cheerfully lumbering through the undergrowth. The postures were wrong. The scale between species was wrong. None of the visitors seemed to mind, because the visitors were mostly 8 years old and thrilled. The park ran for decades, entertaining families across Michigan's summers. It closed in the early 1990s, was eventually cleared, and disappeared without leaving much behind. A few photographs, a few postcards, and the specific kind of nostalgia that hits hardest when a place vanishes before you think to go back. Number 12. Cypress Gardens, Winter Haven, Florida. Before Walt Disney World opened in 1971 and rewired Florida tourism entirely, Cypress Gardens was the jewel of the state's attractions. It opened in 1936, built by Dick Pope Sr. and his wife, Julie, on the shores of Lake Eloise in Winter Haven, and it offered something genuinely lovely. Meticulously maintained botanical gardens wound through a cypress swamp, southern belles in antebellum hoop skirts posed for photographs among the azaleas, and elaborate water ski shows drew crowds from across the country. The water ski shows were something else. Cypress Gardens essentially invented competitive water skiing as a spectator sport, training skiers who went on to compete nationally and internationally. The shows evolved over the decades into elaborate choreographed performances involving human pyramids and aerial jumps, a kind of athletic theater that people drove hundreds of miles to watch. The park appeared in multiple films and television productions, hosted celebrities including Esther Williams and Johnny Weissmuller, and at its peak, drew close to 1 million visitors a year to Central Florida. But Disney's arrival in 1971 changed the economics of Florida tourism permanently. Every major theme park that followed, Disney, Universal, SeaWorld, pulled attention and dollars away from the older, smaller, quieter places that had defined Florida's tourism before the theme park era. Cypress Gardens tried to adapt. It added thrill rides. It rebranded. It tried to appeal to younger visitors who hadn't grown up with its reputation. Nothing worked. The park closed in 2009 after 73 years and was subsequently purchased and converted into Legoland, Florida, which opened in 2011 on the same grounds. Almost nothing of what made Cypress Gardens what it was survived the transition. The botanical gardens are mostly gone, the ski shows are gone, the Southern Belles are long gone. As former park visitors often recalled with real feeling, Cypress Gardens was the Florida that existed before Florida became a theme park. That version didn't make it. Number 11. Splendid China, Kissimmee, Florida. Opened in 1993 in Kissimmee, Florida, Splendid China was a 76-acre theme park featuring over 60 miniature replicas of China's most famous landmarks. The Great Wall stretching across a sculpted hillside, a miniature Forbidden City. The Terracotta Army rendered in careful detail, temples and pagodas from across Chinese history, arranged across a beautifully landscaped property. The ambition was real. The craftsmanship was real. The educational intent was sincere. It was also controversial from the day it opened. Tibetan and Taiwanese advocacy groups protested the park on its opening weekend and maintained a sustained presence for much of its operating life, arguing that the park's version of Chinese history, which included Tibet as part of China and made no mention of Taiwan, reflected the political positions of the Chinese government rather than historical accuracy. The protests attracted national media attention repeatedly throughout the 1990s. Whether the controversy significantly affected attendance is debatable, but it didn't help. What clearly hurt attendance was the competition. Kissimmee sits in the shadow of Walt Disney World, Universal Studios, and SeaWorld, and convincing tourists to spend their limited theme park hours at a miniature replica attraction rather than full-scale rides required a very specific kind of visitor. There were never enough of them. Splendid China closed in 2003 after a decade. The property was subsequently demolished. The site is now largely overgrown, an unusually quiet patch in one of the most overdeveloped tourism corridors in America. Number 10, Atomic Tunnel, near Daytona Beach, Florida. The 1950s gave American roadside culture some remarkable things, and the Atomic Tunnel was one of the stranger ones. Located on US Route 1 about 7 miles south of Daytona Beach, it operated from 1951 to 1959. A former Cold War bomb shelter that someone had the inspired, baffling idea to convert into a tourist attraction. What was inside? Happy the walking fish, a piranha described as man-eating, a monkey named Smokey, a macaw named Mac, dancing mice, and a panorama depicting the domestic quarters of 16th century monks living in Turkey. If that combination of exhibits sounds completely random, that's because it was. The Atomic Tunnel had no coherent theme beyond, "Here are things worth looking at," which was actually a fairly common organizing principle for roadside attractions of its era. The name was the marketing. In 1951, anything labeled atomic drew attention the way things labeled extreme did in the 1990s. The attraction went through a series of name changes: Tunnel of Fantasy, Tropicolor Fantasy, as operators apparently kept second-guessing the branding. Then the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 began routing traffic onto new interstates and away from old US 1, and the steady stream of passing motorists that had sustained the Atomic Tunnel evaporated. It closed in 1959. The building was demolished. Happy the walking fish passed into the great unknown, and whatever monk's panorama had been installed in a Florida bomb shelter presumably went with it. It is one of the few roadside attractions whose loss feels genuinely irreplaceable, if only because nothing quite like it has ever been attempted since. Number 9, the giant orange juice stands, California and Florida. Before fast food conquered every highway exit in America, the roadsides of California and Florida were dotted with giant orange-shaped juice stands. These were actual structures shaped like enormous oranges, often 15 to 20 feet tall, painted a near-fluorescent orange, selling fresh squeezed citrus juice to passing motorists who could see them from a quarter-mile off and found themselves unable not to stop. The concept was pure roadside genius in its simplicity. Make your building look like your product, and you've done all your advertising for free. In the Citrus Belt of the 1920s through the 1950s, these stands were genuinely everywhere. They were independently owned, each one slightly different in design and personality, and collectively, they represented an entire commercial culture built around the novelty of fresh juice and the captive audience of the open road. Then the interstates came and diverted traffic off the old highways where the stands had clustered. Then fast food chains offered standardized convenience that independent operators couldn't match. Then supermarkets started selling bottled orange juice nationally, and the whole concept of stopping at a roadside stand for citrus began to feel like an unnecessary detour. By the 1970s, the giant orange stands had nearly vanished as a category. The few that survived long enough to be documented are preserved in roadside Americana archives. The rest were demolished without ceremony, replaced by whatever came next on their particular stretch of pavement. Number 8, the Land of Oz, Beach Mountain, North Carolina. In 1970, a developer named Grover Robbins decided to open a Wizard of Oz theme park at the summit of Beach Mountain in North Carolina. This required visitors to take a chairlift to the top of the mountain, which filtered the audience pretty effectively. You had to really want to see the Emerald City to make that commitment. The Land of Oz opened in June 1970 with a yellow brick road, a recreated Kansas farmhouse, A full Emerald City with green spires, costumed characters, and theatrical shows staged multiple times a day. It was elaborate. It was genuinely impressive as a mountaintop construction project alone. The park drew well through the early 1970s, but a fire destroyed the Emerald City Amphitheater in 1975, and attendance dropped sharply afterward. The park closed in 1980. What makes the Land of Oz genuinely unusual is what came next. Essentially nothing. The property remained on the mountain. The yellow brick road stayed. The scenery weathered. The character costumes sat in storage. Without the constant maintenance that a working park requires, the whole thing slowly became something more interesting and more melancholy than it had been when it was operational. The park opens once a year for an Autumn at Oz event, but otherwise the mountain keeps its secrets. Dorothy's house is still up there, if you know where to look. The yellow brick road is cracked, but still winding upward through the trees, going somewhere that used to have a name. Number 7. Casper's Alligator and Ostrich Farm, St. Augustine, Florida. Along Florida's U.S. Route 1, Casper's Alligator and Ostrich Farm opened in 1946 and was precisely the kind of attraction that would never receive a permit today. Thousands of alligators and crocodiles in open pits, flamingos wandering freely, exotic birds, a 22-foot African python that presumably just lived there, and the centerpiece, the ostrich cart races, in which ostriches were harnessed to small carts and raced around a track while visitors watched from the stands in what must have been a genuinely chaotic atmosphere. The post-war years were the boom era for Florida roadside animal attractions. Tourists flooding the state for the first time in large numbers wanted to see alligators, the swamp animal they'd heard about but never encountered, and entrepreneurs were happy to oblige. Casper's offered more than just alligators. It offered the full sensory experience of Florida wildlife before that wildlife had been organized into carefully managed parks with safety railings and educational signage. As the decades passed, attitudes toward animal displays in roadside settings shifted. Florida's tourism industry consolidated around larger, more controlled attractions. The small menageries that had thrived in the 1940s and 1950s found it increasingly difficult to meet new standards and compete for tourist dollars. Casper's closed in the early 1980s. The land was repurposed, the ostriches retired. Not a trace of the farm remains along what is now a very different stretch of US 1. Number 6. Jazzland/Six Flags, New Orleans, Louisiana. Jazzland opened in 2000 on 140 acres in eastern New Orleans, the city's first major theme park, featuring themed rides, live entertainment, and an atmosphere meant to capture New Orleans' distinctive character. Six Flags purchased and rebranded it as Six Flags New Orleans in 2002, adding marquee rides and the familiar Six Flags identity to what had been a more locally focused operation. It served the Gulf Coast region as a regional destination for 3 seasons. Then Hurricane Katrina hit in August 2005. Storm surge flooding submerged the park. When the water receded weeks later, Six Flags New Orleans was a ruin. Rides stopped mid-operation and frozen there. Roller coaster track warped by the heat. The pastel park colors fading and peeling in the subtropical climate, vegetation beginning its slow takeover. The park never reopened. Six Flags declared bankruptcy in 2009 and disclaimed responsibility for the site. The city of New Orleans and the property's landowners argued over liability and remediation for years. Nothing moved. The result was one of the most extensively photographed abandoned places in America. An eerie, colorful wreck in the middle of a city still struggling with its own recovery. Urban explorers documented every inch of it. Filmmakers used it as a set. The argument about what to do with it dragged on for nearly 2 decades. The site was finally demolished beginning in 2024, ending the longest-running post-Katrina standoff in New Orleans' landscape. Number 5. The Car Spindle, Berwyn, Illinois. In 1989, artist Dustin Schuler created the Car Spindle for the parking lot of Kermack Plaza Shopping Center in Berwyn, Illinois, a 40-foot steel spike with 8 cars impaled on it at various angles. The cars ranged from a Volkswagen Beetle to larger American models, all stacked vertically on the spike in a configuration that was unmistakably deliberate and unmistakably absurd. As public art goes, it was not subtle. It was also genuinely funny, in the way that only works when someone commits completely to a ridiculous idea. Berwyn sat along old Route 66, and the Car Spindle became a legitimate stop on the Route 66 tourism circuit, one of the few pieces of actual fine art along the corridor. It showed up in guides. People drove to Berwyn specifically to see it. The artist had intended it as commentary on American car culture, and the location in a parking lot made the joke extra specific, which gave it staying power as an idea, even if not everyone understood the critique. The problem was a Portillo's restaurant that opened in the same shopping center. The restaurant's ownership reportedly found impaled automobiles an unwelcoming visual for a fast food establishment and lobbied the shopping center management to have it removed. In 2008, the Car Spindle was demolished without much public ceremony. In its place, more parking lot. The irony was apparently lost on everyone responsible. Number 4, Holy Land, USA. Waterbury, Connecticut. John Baptist Greco was a Waterbury attorney who, beginning in the 1950s, spent decades of his life and most of his personal resources building a biblical theme park on a hilltop overlooking the city. Holy Land, USA was not a commercial enterprise in any conventional sense. Greco charged no admission and accepted donations only. He built the grottos and dioramas and scripture scenes largely by hand, assembling a community of volunteers who shared his vision of creating an outdoor religious education experience accessible to anyone. At its peak, the park drew around 44,000 visitors annually. It was listed in tourist guidebooks. Church groups made it a regular destination. The illuminated cross Greco erected was visible across Waterbury and became a fixture of the city's skyline. When Greco died in 1986, he left the property to a religious order of nuns who maintained it but chose not to reopen it officially. Without maintenance funding and the energy that Greco himself had supplied, the park began to deteriorate slowly, then faster. Statues lost arms and heads. Pathways became overgrown. The dioramas that had once depicted biblical scenes began to look like ruins of something older and stranger. A murder on the property in 2010 brought Holy Land, USA back into the news for entirely different reasons, and what had been a place of pilgrimage for some became, for others, an emblem of urban decline. Renovation plans have been announced and shelved multiple times. The property remains largely in ruins as of this writing, still visible from the highway, still dominated by the illuminated cross that Greco built, still one of the stranger sights in Connecticut. Number 3, Chippewa Lake Park, Chippewa Lake, Ohio. Chippewa Lake Park opened in 1878 in Medina County, Ohio, making it one of the oldest amusement parks in the country by the time it closed exactly a century later. For 100 summers, it ran along the lakeshore, wooden roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, a dance hall where the big bands of the 1930s and 1940s played, a carousel that Ohio families rode for 3 or 4 generations in a row. It was a local institution in the way that only a 100-year-old place can be, not famous nationally, not remarkable by the standards of major parks, but woven into the memory of every family in a 30-mile radius. The park closed abruptly in 1978, its centennial year, citing financial difficulties. What followed is what made Chippewa Lake genuinely singular in American amusement park history. The owners simply walked away and left everything. The roller coaster stayed bolted to its structure. The Ferris wheel stayed standing. A tumblebug car sat motionless on its track, pointed nowhere in particular. The dance hall still had its floor. Over the following decades, trees grew up through and around the rides. weaving through the coaster supports and lifting through the Ferris wheel spokes. The whole site became something between a nature preserve and a monument, one of the most photographically stunning examples of industrial decay in the Midwest. Urban explorers documented Chippewa Lake Park extensively in the 1990s and 2000s, and it became something of a legend in that community. Demolition work in 2009 and 2010 removed some structures. Others remained standing until recently. It is one of those rare places where you could stand in the middle of it and understand both what it had been and what it was becoming at the same time. 100 years of summer compressed into rusted steel and timber, slowly being reclaimed by the trees. The property continues to transition slowly back into Ohio landscape, the rails and timbers disappearing a season at a time, the lake unchanged behind all of it. Number 2, Rockaway's Playland, Queens, New York. For much of the 20th century, Rockaway's Playland was summer in Queens, a beachfront amusement park on the Rockaway Peninsula with the Atlantic Ocean behind it and the city ahead. Wooden roller coasters, arcade games, cotton candy, the specific noise and chaos of a proper American seaside park. For New Yorkers who didn't have cars or vacation budgets, a trip to Rockaway was often the biggest summer outing of the year. The beach was free, the park was close. The roller coasters were fast enough to be worth the price of admission. The park had run in various forms since the early 20th century, survived the Depression, survived the war years, and remained a fixture of Queens' summer life through the post-war decades. By the late 1970s, attendance was declining as the economics of running a beachfront amusement park in New York City became increasingly difficult. A major fire in 1985 damaged large sections of the park, and with the financial numbers already against it, the decision was made not to rebuild. Rockaway's Playland closed permanently. The site sat vacant for years, a large gap in the Rockaway beachfront that the borough couldn't quite figure out what to do with. Eventually, a shopping center was built on part of it. The rest became boardwalk area. The roller coasters and the rides are gone completely, but the neighborhood still talks about the park the way neighborhoods talk about places that belong to everyone and then just stopped existing one day. The Rockaways have a long memory, and Playland is part of it. A place that is gone, but has never quite stopped mattering to the people who remember it at its best. Number 1, Ghost Town in the Sky, Maggie Valley, North Carolina. Ghost Town in the Sky opened in 1961 on the summit of Buck Mountain near Maggie Valley, North Carolina, and it committed to the concept harder than most. To reach the park, visitors took a chairlift, a full mountain chairlift ride, up to the summit where a Wild West-themed town waited, complete with staged gunfights in the street, can-can dancers, mountain roller coasters, and the genuinely spectacular views of the Blue Ridge Mountains that you got for free just by being up there. At its peak in the 1960s and 1970s, Ghost Town in the Sky was the most visited attraction in North Carolina. People came from across the Southeast specifically for it. The chairlift ride alone became part of the attraction's identity. You were going somewhere that required effort to reach, and that felt like a genuine adventure before the gunfights even started. The park went through cycles of closure and reopening through the 1980s and 1990s as ownership changed and financial pressures mounted. A major landslide in 2003 caused significant infrastructure damage. A serious effort to reopen and renovate the park was underway in 2007 and 2008, but the financial crisis of 2008 killed the investment. The park has not operated in any sustained way since the early 2000s. Today, the buildings sit empty on top of Buck Mountain. The chairlift towers still stand. The saloon and the sheriff's office and the gunfighter stage are still up there, weathering in the mountain air, accessible only to the occasional trespasser willing to hike to the summit. Ghost Town in the Sky is one of the few attractions on this list that still physically exists. It just happens to be inaccessible, abandoned and deteriorating at roughly 4,600 feet above sea level, which is, in its own way, a very dramatic ending for a Wild West theme park. There's something genuinely strange about a country that could build all of this. Impaled cars in a shopping center parking lot, ostrich racing on the Florida coast, a biblical hilltop in Connecticut, a theme park shaped from the air like the United States itself, and then simply let it disappear. Some of these places closed because the money ran out. Some because an interstate bypassed them and took their traffic with it. Some because a fire or a hurricane made the decision for everyone. And some just because America moved on, the way it always has, toward whatever was newer and louder and more certain of its own relevance. If you're old enough to remember pulling off the highway for one of these places, you already know what was lost. And if you're not, the concrete dinosaurs really were better than you'd think. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.